Welcome back to World Series News, and I've got Simon on the line again from Florida with a brand new, let's call it a counterintelligence report at this stage. This is the news that is simply not being reported, and it will answer a lot of questions you have as to why, at least here in Australia, we're hearing positive and negative news simultaneously concerning China. You've got Andrew's secret visit to China coming back and saying it's not about him, it's not about the reporter, it's about the Victorian people. And in the very same mainstream news broadcast, you're getting the New South Wales Premier telling you about concerns with war with China and the start of World War III. It seems that our politicians are letting all of us down because we don't know what's going on. So as we look for more and more news, Simon is joining me now. I'm delighted that he's been able to make the time for us. He's just come off George Galloway's show. This is a show that gets over 1 million views twice a week. Simon was on InfoWars on the weekend, also getting massive coverage there. And I'm very lucky that he's been able to make time. Simon, I'm going to bring you in right now. Welcome back to World Series News.
Jason, thank you ever so much. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Once again, the world is spinning at an even faster pace, and there's a lot to cover.
Look, there certainly is, and it seems that there's a lot of confusion around China, but also with the deal with Russia. Now, Russia, we're told here in Australia, is weak and may lose the war in Ukraine. And in the very same commentator's breath on our own Today show here in Australia, we're now told that the NATO alliance can't let Russia win the war in Ukraine. I don't understand how you can have two different messages from the same commentator in the same 2-minute interview. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Russia's foreign policy is, the latest that's just come out of the Kremlin?
Well, I'll explain psychologically why that's happening with a lot of commentators, because they're saying what they've been told to say, and every now and again they slip into saying what they know to be true.
Okay.
And that's why you're getting mixed messages. And it's the same with President Biden. He's clearly suffering from dementia. He's reading scripts. And when he goes off script, occasionally what is called, and this is being quite medical about it, a moment of lucidity. Mm-hmm. And he literally has like a memory flashback, and he grasps onto that, and he speaks about what he knows to be true. Mm. And when you watch his speeches, you can actually see that happen, and then he lapses back. So it's the kind of thing that if you're a very keen observer, you can watch out for. But we know that lots of these spokespeople, they're just paid liars. Mm. But they know that the journalists know that they're lying, and every now and again they throw out a tidbit of real information just so that they don't have a complete loss of credibility. So unfortunately at this point, the propaganda is so thick that it's like we would see in the Soviet Union in the 50s or 60s, where it's almost to the point where we're at reverse speak, and you've got to turn everything on its head to get close to the truth.
Look, that makes a lot of sense, and so many people, and particularly the people making the news too, with the banning and the shadow banning, which goes towards being considered not credible, when in fact this is exactly the opposite, isn't it? It's like a countermove in all of it. So the best thing that we can do is to find the best information, being able to interpret the best information, and clearly point out where the anomalies lie and where the narratives truly are. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. But the powers that be, whatever you want to call them, the deep state or the New World Order or whatever, they're acutely aware of the abundance of information. And that's why we're not only dealing with flat out blunt censorship, but we're also dealing with perception management. And now you have this push both in Canada, Australia, the United Kingdom, and worldwide with UNESCO with their fledgling program, Internet for Truth, where they literally want to regulate speech on the internet in order to remove what they choose to classify as disinformation. And we may well be in the closing months of any semblance of free speech in the Western world whatsoever.
It's truly astonishing, isn't it? So I think the best thing that we can do at this point is to point this out and to have our audience ask the questions. There's some really frightening things going on at the moment. The idea that there may even be penalties for people accessing certain websites, even with a VPN. So this would get a lot of the people that have been on this side of the fence up in arms, and perhaps this is where a broader audience might eventually tune in and realise that they too have been played all along. Let's go back and start now with what happened with Russia, because this is very, very significant and will show us that Russia is not weak at all.
So this week, there was a meeting of the Russian Security Council, and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, presented to them his new concept for Russia's foreign policy, which was subsequently adopted and approved and issued in the form of a decree by President Putin. Now, this may seem remote and arcane, and I can understand people thinking that. But what they've got to bear in mind is that the relationship that has existed for several years and was reinforced by the meeting between President Xi and President Putin in Moscow a couple of weeks ago is that of a comprehensive strategic partnership of coordination that is the highest ranking diplomatic relationship that China has with any other country in the world. And the key word there is coordination. So when Russia puts out a 76 paragraph statement, as they have, regarding their foreign policy, then it is absolutely certain that the Chinese had this in advance and had the opportunity to make suggestions or give feedback, even assuming that one can't assume that it is now a joint policy. Now, I can't prove that it is a Russia and China policy, but it is without doubt that they are cooperating. So they may have slight nuances and they may have different priorities, but the level of interaction between these two nuclear powers is extremely high indeed. And one should remember that President Xi insisted that the Russian prime minister, the level below President Putin, very soon go back to China with a full ministerial and civil service delegation, so that all of the 14 plans that he signed agreements for with President Putin could start to be directly implemented. So these are just not like statements of friendship or non-aggression pacts or, we'll all get together on the first Monday of the month and have beers. These are like hard deals that they are in a hurry to implement. So the key thing that was in this long document that first came out into Russian, I was translating it like paragraph by paragraph, but then about 36 hours later it came out in English, so people are now able to read it with much more ease, is Russia has explained the overarching concept. And this is extremely important for Australia because it involves a lot of your trade partners, not just China. Okay. So the overall scheme, and this is like spelt out in writing. So it's not like I woke up this morning with a hangover and, thought I'd come up with a conspiracy theory, right? They are saying that they will integrate the Commonwealth of Independent States, at least those of which remain friendly, because Moldova may exclude itself. Basically, the former parts of the Soviet Union, excluding the Baltic states, with the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the Eurasian Economic Union, pretty much every country in the Middle East, and ASEAN, which is 10 significant countries in Asia, which form another large component of Australia's trading partners beyond China. So if this forms as a bloc, and it's not a regional bloc, it's a global bloc. So they're extending the invitation to the full organization of Islamic countries, which would include Indonesia, which is basically the closest country to major country to Australia, if I'm not mistaken, right? And it's also going to be extended to almost all the countries in Africa. Brazil seem very interested. Argentina seem very interested. You're going to have Venezuela, Cuba, and some of the Caribbean islands now that Barbados has left the British Commonwealth and Jamaica has left the British Commonwealth. And in this gigantic grouping that's essentially a large economic federation, it's going to be called the Greater Eurasian Partnership. Now, this is a scheme that President Putin came up and enunciated in 2015. But just like the Mackinder concept of the heartland and the world island fighting against the naval powers that he enunciated in 1904, because of subsequent events, it's undergone a revision, just like the Mackinder scheme underwent a revision in 1919 after the First World War. So in this version now, it expressly excludes the United States. It expressly excludes the United Kingdom, that they do not even refer to by name. The United Kingdom is derisively referred to as the Anglo-Saxons. Now, it is open to individual members of the European Union to join, but not as a bloc and subject to an express condition. Now, this condition, once again, is extremely relevant to your listeners in Australia, because no doubt they'll all be aware that not only are they now partnered with Britain and America in AUKUS, but they're also partnered in the Quad, which is India, Japan, America, and Australia. Okay. Now, the condition for these other countries that are in unfriendly groupings, both to China and to Russia, for them to participate in this new global scheme, what one might call the new era, which is referenced several times in all these documents, okay, is strategic independence. Now, you, Nicola, and I discussed this before, and I said you've got strategic autonomy and strategic independence. They're exactly the same concept, and the words autonomy and independence are being used interchangeably. And what that means is breaking away from American dominance. One of the goals of this scheme is to diminish and eradicate American hegemony. And therefore, in order to partner with China and or Russia, you cannot be a vassal state taking your orders from the United States of America. So this is just like a vast, vast scheme. And Z is playing the role of nightclub bouncer. So he is literally vetting people, and you've got nations flocking to Beijing to meet with him. And what a lot of people don't realize is that Dan Andrews was a distraction, and that whilst he was visiting the 3 provinces in China, you had the federal Australian trade minister was there at exactly the same time cutting deals. Now, to get all the Chinese sanctions off Australia and get the trade back to where it was and expand it, and particularly for Australia to have any relationship with this new greater Eurasian partnership, they're going to have to significantly difference themselves from the United States. And even though I did not anticipate that it would be a week as opposed to a year, this is exactly what I meant when I previously said that the long-term submarine deal would, in my opinion, be quickly superseded by events. And that is exactly what is happening. These people are talking about doing this kind of structure this year and next year, not in 15 years' time. Putin will be in his mid-80s at that point. He wants to see this in his lifetime.
Yes.
Right? So he's not like, the Chinese may look on things in 100 or 1,000-year time frame, but Putin has lived through great changes. You've got to remember that his family background is from St. Petersburg, where the Russian Revolution started. So he's been aware through his parents of that era, the communist era, the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet Union, and now whatever you want to describe, the new resurgence that he's trying to bring into place, working with the Chinese. Okay, so this isn't fanciful. It's not an idea that I've come up with. It's not something that you've come up with. It's in a decree from the president of the Russian Federation that has undoubtedly been agreed in advance with the People's Republic of China. So it affects pretty much everyone in the world.
It's absolutely extraordinary information that we're now understanding and seeing that's happening here in real time. We want to move on and talk about India, and we also want to talk about this incredible situation that's happened with OPEC over the weekend. And I just want to save a little bit of room by planting the seed with you now, Simon, I just want to do a little bit of analysis of Biden's America and perhaps, if we can, tie it into the circumstances around the whole Trump arraignment that's headed this week at the very end of our chat today. But let's move right now into what's happening now in relation to India and its foreign policy concept, because this is all very, very significant.
Right. So about 3 weeks ago, the same man, Sergei Lavrov, gave a long interview on a TV show in Russia called The Great Game. It's the top political show, kind of like 60 Minutes would be in Australia or something like that. And he was asked if the Indians would remain neutral with regards to Russia and the Ukraine situation indefinitely. And he gave this kind of cryptic answer that he had a high degree of confidence in Russia's relationship with India, and that he wasn't dictating anything to them and he wasn't pushing them, but that India would show its hand in its own sweet time. Okay? Mm-hmm. So on Friday, rather unexpectedly, after a 3-year gap due to COVID, because India, like the old Soviet Union and China, was operating on 5-year economic plans. And they had a 2015 to 2020. Then that got extended because of COVID, and they were just rolling it year to year to year. All of a sudden, they announced the 2023 to 2028 new Indian foreign trade policy. Now, that may seem a bit like a thing only for economists and bankers, but India is now the biggest country in the world. Their population has just slightly exceeded China. Okay, so when we're talking about China at 1.4 billion and India at like 1.45 billion. You add those two together, that's a heck of a lot of the world. Okay, so they have announced that they want to triple their exports by 2030 from where they currently are. Now, in order to do that, they need 21% compound growth year after year after year for 7 years. That is an incredibly tall order.
Of course.
Okay? But as I discussed on your last show, and people that involve me, and people can go back and listen to that, they had recently cut a deal with the Iranians and they had cut a deal with the Russians. So following on from those incredible developments, they explained that they were not only going to increase the number of free ports that would be duty free around the coastline of India, but that any import that was intended for the manufacture of goods that would be subsequently exported from India would henceforth no longer be subject to any importation duties. And so that reduces the cost of production of finished goods that India can then export. Now, what was really amazing, because this obviously was a complicated document, right? Guess what the time frame was, and I appreciate this is somewhat rhetorical, for the start of this program. So it's a big document, unexpected, some massive changes, including the announcement that they wanted to de-dollarize their economy and internationalize the Indian rupee so it would be used all over the world. What do you think their time frame for starting this scheme was?
Oh, blow me away with the answer.
The next day.
Wow. It's incredible, isn't it? There is just no time to be wasted on anything that's going on at the moment.
I mean, it just seems almost impossible for the civil service to even finish reading the document.
Yes.
And they're like, starting tomorrow, these following policies are going to change. And it's not like, we're going to spell Monday with an I at the end instead of a Y. I mean, these are huge, multi-year international changes. And when you think back on the deal that they've done to build this new city that is going to be finalized in a couple of weeks, likely on another visit to Moscow, and the deal that they've done with the Iranians, they are just completely ignoring any kind of US sanctions on Iran and Russia. And they're just brazenly saying, we're going to deal in rupees. So what are you going to do about it? And what are they going to do about it? It puts them in a very, very difficult position because the United States, via Blinken and Sullivan and Kirby, have repeatedly said, we respect that India is a leader of the non-aligned movement. We can't dictate foreign policy to them. They're the biggest country in the world. They're relying upon them to participate in their strategy to contain China. But that strategy may just be shot full of 50 holes as of this weekend. And so not only do we have the Malaysians who have gone to CZ, they've cut a deal with him. We haven't seen the exact details of what was agreed by Australia or by Mrs. Mahuta, the New Zealand foreign minister, who went to China. But we have seen what has happened with the Belarusians, and we have seen what has happened with the Spanish. Now, the Spanish were clearly on a mission, even though they're fellow socialists, to try and ensure that China would not intervene on behalf of Russia in the Ukrainian conflict. But it seems that got relegated right to the bottom of the agenda. And the president of China and his premier and the director of the foreign ministry were all using the phrase strategic independence. And they told Prime Minister Sanchez in no uncertain terms whatsoever that if he wants to continue the really sweet relationship that he has with the People's Republic of China, he had better start backing away from the United States, which is difficult for two reasons. Not only is Spain a base holder for the Americans through NATO, but obviously they're a major part of the European Union. But what's interesting is starting yesterday, there's now a year-long festival of tourism between China and Spain. So clearly some kind of arrangement was reached that even if it's in words only to start with, Spain is going to back away from any kind of anti-China stance. Now, if you think about the countries that have been excluded both by Russia and China in this greater Eurasian partnership, right? Start thinking about the world financial centers. So you've got in your time zone, Sydney, okay? You've got Tokyo, major international financial center. You've got Frankfurt, that's out because the Germans are supporting Ukraine hard, okay? The UK, they won't even say their name. So London is completely out, top of the nuclear targeting list, right? And of course, New York and Chicago are out with the stock market and the Chicago Board of Trade, okay? So the Singaporean prime minister goes to Xi. He suddenly gets some new status, like this bizarre all-weather strategic partnership of high confidence with technology, like some really odd name. Okay, I mean, I'm being literal, right? And everyone's like, what's going on there? What's the one thing that Singapore is really famous for? And it's not in any of those other countries.
Tell us.
It's the financial center.
And
all of these countries, be it Beijing or Moscow or Kazakhstan or Riyadh, they're going to want the Asian equivalent of Switzerland to be their neutral banker. And Singapore fits that role absolutely perfectly. So you can see that it's not just culture and it's not military interests and it's not personal relationships, but it's always follow the money as well. So everyone's first question is always, okay, so I'm going to do this with you and you're going to do this, and who's going to hold the bag? And the answer there would appear to be Singapore. So this is an enormous opportunity for Singapore. Hong Kong is too close to China. Tokyo's out of the question. Sydney seems very unlikely. It's geographically remote as well as politically doubtful for them. So Singapore walked away with this new highfalutin deal, the biggest grin on his face, as though he's been told he's just been given like 100 Chinese concubines or something. All right. So, I mean, lots of the pieces of the puzzle are falling into place. Now, in relation to the European Union, the president of the European Union there is Mrs. von der Leyen, who's somewhat infamous for her dodgy dealings with Pfizer over the jab contracts.
Yes.
She was the German defense minister and was not good in that role, and basically got promoted up from being a terrible defense minister to being the European Union president. Now, she gave a speech last week in advance of her trip with President Macron of France to go and visit the Chinese, which is going to happen within the next 10 days. And her speech was a bit odd, but it was exactly like your opening question. Why are we being told one thing and then the person seems to reverse themselves before they get to the end of the announcement? So your observation there is exactly on point. And that was the observation that the Chinese made, both their ambassador to the European Union and all their media. So the speech started off praising China and having thousands of years of culture and history and how important it was for Europe to have a relationship with them. Okay, so very nice, very diplomatic, very lovey-dovey. Then she went on to this whole issue of China having demonstrated unfriendly attitudes to the European Union, particularly in regard to Ukraine, and that whilst it wasn't in Europe's interest to decouple entirely in terms of severing trade or diplomatic relations between Europe and China, which obviously would be absolutely devastating for the European economy, having already taken a severe hit because of the joint sanctions on Russian energy, that she still felt that it was necessary to de-risk the relationship. Okay, so that was going from step 1 to step 2. Then step 3 was the complete reversal. And so having apparently attempted to thread the needle and not follow American sanctions onto Hong Kong and Chinese companies that have already started, okay, she then said, but we have to remember that we need to stay aligned with our partners, which was obviously saying we're going to do what the Americans tell us. So the Chinese were furious, like furious. And not only did the ambassador to the EU come out and give an interview about 10 or 15 minutes, roundly criticizing both the incoherence and the contradictory nature of her speech, but also pointing out that Europe could not afford to designate China as its enemy, which is entirely true. Yes. And there have been discussions among 27 nations of the European Union, and 10 of them have privately, but the number has been leaked from the meeting that they held on Wednesday and Thursday last week. They have said under no circumstances whatsoever are we agreeing to sanctions against China. We're like hanging on by a thread with all the sanctions against Russia, and it would be like mad to now start sanctioning China. So she obviously was hoping to be able to put pressure upon Xi to maintain his distance from Russia in order that America didn't give Europe an order to say, now you must do a full set of sanctions on China. But the reaction was so strong, and I discussed this with several other analysts, and we ended up going through the statements and the press commentary, which obviously is largely state-controlled in China. And I was like explaining to them, and they were pointing out things to me. It was a good kind of like group discussion, that they were so offended that they said that they would educate the president of the European Union when she arrived in China. That is not diplomatic language.
That is not.
Okay? Now, the president of Taiwan has gone via America to visit the few nations that still recognize Taiwan in South and Central America. And then on her way back, she's going to meet with Speaker McCarthy. And as a riposte to that, while she was doing her trip, the government of China invited the former president of Taiwan to go on a tour in China. Okay. Now, his party is pro-reunification of China. Her party is pro-independence. Okay. So there's going to be an election coming up fairly soon, and it's obviously incredibly important who is going to win that election. Now, even though it will make Australian socialists raise their hands in horror, the former president of Taiwan, who's pro-unification, expressed the fact that the Taiwanese and Chinese people are all of one race. Okay, which is stating the obvious. Okay, and he's also been saying that all of the direct flights that were broken off because of COVID are being reestablished, and that 50% of the trade that Taiwan does, and a lot of people don't realize this, is in fact with China. So if China would have put hard sanctions and a blockade on Taiwan, it would just cut their economy enormously. Okay?
Yeah.
Now, the Americans are fixated on Ukraine and they're fixated on Taiwan. And they, having provoked the whole Ukraine situation, obviously now regret that and are very worried about what they could realistically do to counteract any direct military intervention by China. Now, I think it's crystal clear at this point that the Chinese goal regarding Taiwan is to say to them, here is this enormous partnership everywhere from Spain to Vladivostok that you can become a part of. We'll give you a deal like Macau and Hong Kong. Why don't you just become a part of that and everyone makes money? And frankly, that seems pretty attractive. And I understand that there's a lot of historical animosity, and I understand that a lot of people in Taiwan have been uncomfortable about how democracy has been suppressed to an extent in Hong Kong. But in terms of their quality and standard of living, it may well be that the opportunities that China can present as part of the greater Eurasian partnership are enough to swing, say, 10% of the population and take it from, say, 45% reunification to 55% reunification, such that if a referendum were to be held, the deal would go through. And because we're not saying that you need to get 100%, we're just saying that you need to swing it so that it's clearly over 50.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Now, Japan, on the other hand, their foreign minister went to visit China and he took an absolute shellacking. So it was very public that when the Taiwanese former prime minister was taken to various cultural places to visit, he was taken to the shrine in Nanking that commemorates the thousands or tens of thousands of Chinese civilians who were massacred by the army of Japan. So that was a very public reminder of the past animosity between China and Japan. Now, during the week, under American pressure, Japan extended sanctions on Russia in terms of time, and they also announced that they were going to be stopping selling advanced microchips to China because they were worried that they would be resold on to the Russians. Okay, which on the face of it makes sense, but Japan gets not only 25% of its natural gas supplies from Russia, but it also gets a lot of food from China. And amazingly, on the list of items that it placed sanctions on China directly last week were children's toys.
Wow.
Children's toys. So that's just absurd. Okay. Now you can say, well, if they were laptops or video games, then maybe there'd be a chip in that could be repurposed to like fly a drone, for example.
Sure.
Okay. But it wasn't that specific. So it's couched in diplomatic terms. And this was another thing that I discussed, because sometimes when you're not from Asia and you're trying to interpret issues that are matters of credibility and, say, face saving, for example, right? It's always best to get a second opinion. But the consensus was that particularly in the final meeting between the Chinese foreign minister and the Japanese foreign minister, where even in the video, their faces were extremely glum, like, who let one rip, right? They basically gave them what I termed a just war warning, which was basically, you're right on the ledge, on the limit, back off. This is your final warning. Okay? And
Yes.
this is exactly what President Putin and Lavrov did with the European Union and with America again and again and again in relation to Ukraine. Now, the other thing that Japan has done that has got the Chinese very concerned is, many people may remember that when General MacArthur, became essentially the Governor General of Japan after World War II, right? He didn't remove the Japanese emperor, but he did change the constitution. And he made it a pacifist constitution. They renounced the use of force worldwide. Now, Japan's done a little bit of peacekeeping operations, but specifically only like medics and logistics, right? And only with full United Nations Security Council approval. Okay? So they never wanted to be seen to ever invade or declare war on anybody. Now, in relation to China, they've now announced that they're going to position American-supplied missiles on the Nassau Islands, just 1,000 kilometers from the coast of China. And they're also massively increasing their defense budget, in part because their new defense policy for Japan states that the independence of Taiwan is of strategic importance to the nation of Japan. And that is direct and clear-cut intervention in the internal domestic affairs as China sees it in its relationship with Taiwan. So they have crossed red line after red line after red line, real serious missteps. And they're very clearly in a defense alliance with America, and America has troops stationed in Okinawa. Okay, so the Chinese have given the Japanese a last chance. They've said, we respect you as fellow Asians, and you can come and be part of this partnership, but you've got to dump the Americans.
This is the most incredible news that we're hearing in real time. It's almost like the fast forward button is pressed as hard as it possibly can at this point. And it seems that for anyone in the West has been brainwashed to believe that it will be the Russians that are going to resort to a nuclear weapon to get themselves out of trouble, to save face, or whatever it is that they're trying to preach. But it seems that America's been backed into a corner now. Their economic power is taken away. Their military might is completely exposed as not being as powerful as it makes itself out to be. And it may well be the Americans that have to pull it off one way or another to drop the big nuke at the end of all of this, because they've got nowhere else to go but to surrender. This is the very nervous feeling I'm getting out of all of this. Maybe we talk about that at the conclusion of our show, Simon, but perhaps by highlighting what's happened with OPEC and OPEC Plus over the weekend will give the average person who's going to watch this show and to share it with their family and friends something in real time that's going to affect them, that's very, very obvious, with the price of oil jumping over $5 a barrel on a Sunday. What's going on?
So they didn't make a specific announcement tying all of these events together. But when you look at what's happening with Iran, who's not a member of OPEC, and what's happening with India, and what's been happening in Kazakhstan with their recent elections, and with Russia, who's a member of OPEC Plus, there's clearly a direction where members of both the Gulf Cooperation Council and the Arab members of OPEC are indicating in a roundabout way that they are closely cooperating with Russia. Now, Russia and Saudi Arabia are the two largest, by far, members of OPEC Plus. So you have the original OPEC, and then you've got countries who joined after 1980, and they're what's called the OPEC Plus. So it's like BRICS and BRICS Plus.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, on a Sunday, in advance of their Monday meeting, Saudi Arabia, Russia, Oman, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq all announced that they were going to be making production cuts from now all the way through until the end of the year. Now, what was interesting is that Kazakhstan joined in with that, and Algeria, who's now a major energy supplier to France, Italy, and Spain, also, very surprisingly, joined in to the announcement. Now, the meeting's not even over, okay, because it runs on Monday. So other countries that haven't yet made any announcement, like Nigeria or Bahrain or Qatar, there's still time for them to join. But already the cut amounts to over 1.5 million barrels a day. So in the Middle East, because obviously Australia is like way ahead of the United States, right? And in the Middle East, their Sunday is like a Monday in Australia. Mm-hmm. They have like a half day Friday and they have Saturday off. And Sunday is a regular business day, right? So the price of oil jumped over $5.50. So that's like 7%. Mm-hmm. And we're not even done with the meeting yet.
Yes.
So obviously the price of oil affects the price of plastics, the price of medicines, the price of shipping and logistics, and just how much it costs to fill up your family car. Okay? So if we see even more countries make announcements and we go from, say, 1.5 to 2 million, that's a big step. Now, they're claiming that they're doing this, and this is the other interesting thing, preemptively to stabilize the price of oil. And it has been whipping around quite a bit because people were worried about there being a banking collapse and interest rates going up. And so that would, because people's credit card bills were higher and it was harder to get a mortgage, they would be directing their resources, driving less. And so the demand for petrol and gas would be less, just regular economics, right? Mm. But this is a big step. It wasn't expected. And what we normally see with these institutions, be it the IMF or the Reserve Bank of Australia or the Federal Reserve in the United States or the Bank of England or the Bank of Japan, is that nowadays they do what is called forward signaling. So they give you an idea of what's likely to happen so that there's not a big shock. Now, this was not forward signaled, okay? So that tends to indicate that they are not only acting in unison, but they're acting in unison with an underlying scheme. Now, what is the underlying scheme? It's Russia and China proposing this new Gulf Collective Security Organization that effectively make the American presence in the Middle East completely redundant. Mm-hmm. Now, I saw an article from a renowned analyst in a prestigious magazine, and this is the kind of dichotomy that the Chinese are talking about and that I immediately noticed. So he was like, well, if we have peace in the Middle East, excluding for the moment Israel, that from a humanitarian perspective is a good thing. And I think everyone in Australia would agree with that, right? But he then said, just because we have regional peace doesn't mean that America won't need to be there anymore. And you're like, hang on a second. If everyone's stopped fighting, why do we need 50,000 American troops to protect Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Oman and Bahrain and the UAE from Iran, if they're now going to start investing tens of billions of dollars in Iran and shipping goods by train via Iraq? It doesn't sound like they're about to attack each other.
Correct.
And that's what I'm talking about, the dichotomy and the disconnect, that they think that all these things can change for the good, and yet they somehow will remain completely unaffected and maintain their military threat presence in the heart of that region. And it just seems ridiculous. And I'm not saying that it'll happen next week, but maybe it'll happen in a year or 2 years, and they'll have bases that the rights to use them come up for renewal. And just like the Philippines did when Subic and Clark came up for renewal, they just say, no, you can't use our main airfield and you can't use that huge submarine base. You knew it was coming up. We indicated to you we weren't going to renew it. You've got 3 months to get out. And this is the kind of huge sea change that we're happening. And the American public and even the American elite or intelligentsia or State Department diplomats, whatever you want to call them, they are completely unable to come to terms with both the speed and the magnitude of the events that are occurring to them.
Correct. So when do we see, or when will it be possible that the American elite / intelligentsia operatives and the American public eventually turn on the Biden administration and say, hey, what gives? We have completely dropped the ball here.
Well, just a couple of days ago, you had a group of retired military officers and State Department officials say, it looks like there's about to be an outbreak of peace, and that's going to put our troops in Syria in a difficult position. And America should either block that or make sure that the countries that conclude a peace deal, such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, get compromises or sacrifices from the president of Syria before relations are normalized. But America's not in any position to dictate those kind of terms. It now appears highly likely that Syria is going to be invited fully back into the Arab League in May. And 2 weeks ago, it looked like that might happen next year. And now it's appearing highly likely that it's going to happen in 6 weeks. So not only are these things being done at a fast pace, but there's such a high degree of goodwill, cooperation, and superpower supervision that they are being done even faster than anybody thought conceivably possible. I'll give you another example. The foreign minister of Iran and Saudi Arabia had a telephone conversation today. Now, they're working on this 2-month time frame to try and reestablish their embassies. So the end date of that was going to be May the 10th. Okay, if you took 60 days from when they did their deal on March the 10th. They've now said that they had a great conversation. They discussed not only their bilateral relations, but multilateral security issues, i.e. how fast can we get the Americans out the Gulf, right? And they're going to meet in 2 or 3 days, not 2 months, 2 or 3 days to finalize all of this aspect of the restoration of diplomatic relations. Because I had thought it strange that potentially the president of Iran was going to go on a state visit to hang out with the king of Saudi Arabia before they had even exchanged ambassadors. Now, that procedural step has obviously come up. And so now they're in a frantic rush to restore full diplomatic relations before the state visit occurs. And that's why it's being done even faster than the self-imposed May 10th deadline. So we may see that ambassadors get exchanged in a couple of weeks, and Raisi flies over to Riyadh in a month. And then you'll have a full, king versus head of state with Iran visit. And I guarantee on the back of that, there will be the announcement about a whole load of Saudi investments into Iran. And what then is the knock-on consequence of that? And I tell you what, it makes it really hard to happen is for the Americans and the Israelis to then start blowing things up in Iran. Because if the Saudis own them 50% and the Indians own them 25%, and the Omanis own them 5%, and the Kuwaitis own them 5%, and the Americans start blowing them up, that's not going to go down very well. And it risks all of the countries that have signed the Abraham Accords and have started doing business and having diplomatic relations with Israel, all turning round, and even if they don't declare war, saying all of the deals that we've done with you under Trump, they're all off.
Geez, we're right really in the thick of all of it. Now, we're running out of time here. We've come up to our hour. So unless we can make this the last question as we round it all up. But the significance of the Trump arraignment in all of this, are we watching more theatre given the watered down type of charges that are going on and the rhetoric behind it all? Are we in fact seeing a Trojan horse, that this is just an example of what's going to flip on all of the people that are pretending that they're sitting on the moral high ground with all of the classified document scandals, the Hunter Biden laptop and the rest of it? What's your take on Trump's role in all of this, or is it too late and too little for the US, including a Trump counter-attack?
In some regards, the whole situation with Trump is nothing but a distraction. But you have to remember that he did actually manage to maintain peace in Ukraine during his term in office, even though there was obviously some very dodgy financial deals going on involving the Bidens and also Mitt Romney and some other politicians and their children. So it was clear that even during that period, Ukraine was being used as a money laundering center. And there's no doubt that that is occurring now, but times 100. So we're not talking about $1 billion or $2 billion. We're talking about 100 or $200 billion. So the vested interests, such as the arms manufacturers in both Europe and in the United States, really don't want that situation to end anytime soon, because they've lost their favorite war, which was Afghanistan. Okay. And there's a lot more business to be had in Ukraine. Now, Trump has made this incredibly bold statement that he can bring peace to Ukraine within 24 hours of his inauguration if he were to be re-elected. But what he doesn't really seem to fully appreciate is that this is no longer a rational business transaction that he is excellent at. It's now an existential fight. And it's very much got religious and cultural components to it as well. And so it's not like he can just say to Putin, I'll give you $1 billion, or we'll buy all the wheat you can make, or kind of like put some financial sweetener in. We're like way, way beyond that point. So it's very hard to see how he can easily bring about a settlement to that situation. DeSantis, who obviously is his main primary opponent so far on the Republican side, made some quite anti-Ukrainian statements. That clearly got the New World Order deeply upset, and he's now done a complete volte-face on those. But it was clear, because he worked in military intelligence before he became a congressman, that he understands the true nature of the situation there. But I'm starting to have thoughts about whether or not China is going to really drop a load, so to speak, on the world community, and either come out with a revelation about American funding for the creation of COVID that completely turns the whole world opinion, even more so than it currently is, against America, but would also split the entire European Union away from the American control, because they took it on the chin with Nord Stream 2.
Yes.
But that didn't affect all of the countries, and it didn't affect them all in terms of capital loss. It put the energy prices up, but that's pretty much stabilized. But what would the German government do, and what would the Spanish and the French government do if the Chinese government came out and said, we're real sorry, it did leak, but we were only doing this because the Americans were paying us to do it because it was part of their biological weapons program?
Goodness me.
I'm not saying this is going to happen,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
I'm saying
yeah.
imagine, right?
Exactly right. Yep.
Okay, so all of the European Union, it would probably cause the breakup of NATO, right? I mean, people would just be so disgusted.
Yeah.
And you'd have a $10 trillion lawsuit against the American government, right?
Yes.
So I think that there are things like that they could do if they find that the business opportunities are insufficient alone to peel off Australia, to peel off New Zealand, to peel off Spain, okay? Because that in itself develops its own momentum. If you're France and Marine Le Pen is very anti the Ukraine war, and you're in Italy and ex-Prime Minister Conte just came out against the Ukraine war, and the same in Greece, and the same in Bulgaria, and the same in Romania, and the same in Hungary, then it develops its own momentum. And all of a sudden, you've got half of Europe saying, we want to be with China, not with America. Because what have they got from America in the last 10 years? They've got nothing but pain. America is energy independent. Their electricity bills didn't go up 6 or 7 or 10-fold, and it's very much the Europeans. They may not have put most of the money in as a series of government handouts to Ukraine, but certainly in terms of the costs that were borne during the last 12 months, in terms of energy and food prices, they've very, very much been focused within the European Union as opposed to within the United States of America. And that's exactly how the United States of America fought World War II. There weren't German bombers dropping bombs on Washington, D.C. There weren't Japanese bombers dropping bombs in San Francisco like they did in Darwin, right? And so a lot of people have figured out this appears to be the American plan. They're going to run this whole proxy war 5,000 miles away from its shores. And people are getting a little bit cheesed off about this. And the one thing that we have discussed previously, but with Nicola, but that we haven't discussed tonight, and I'll just throw this out as a concept, because it's very, very much in the mind of the Chinese, in writing, not my speculation, and the Gulf Cooperation Council of the Middle East, and the Asian nations, and also many of the African nations, is the cultural issue. And these are quite conservative, traditional, family-oriented societies, either because of Islam or because of Buddhism or because of socialism in the People's Republic of China. And they believe in traditional nuclear families. And we've seen it with the Russian Orthodox Church and with President Putin, both in their national security doctrine and in their new foreign policy doctrine, playing great emphasis upon the cultural protection and civilization traditionally of these countries. And the one thing that is common between Ukraine the European Union and the United States and Canada and Australia and New Zealand is, without getting into specifics, is we can all appreciate that in the last 20 years, we have had the most profound societal, cultural changes, specifically in relation to sex and gender, that anybody in their 40s, 50s, or 60s would possibly have imagined, 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And so these countries expressly reject that change. And so even though you're dealing with Muslims and capitalists and with socialists in China, that is the one thing, apart from money, that they all have in common is relatively traditional cultures. And even though they're willing to embrace 5G and 6G and the internet, they don't want to see the breakdown of the traditional family unit. And they are willing to go to great lengths in order to defend that. And so when we have, Penny Wong going off advocating lesbianism in Malaysia or something like that, no matter what your opinion as an individual Australian or American citizen, you have to understand that in the countries that you wish to have alliances with, that is really causing a lot of offense. And they don't have to accept that total reformation of their civilization by simply choosing to do business deals with China, because that culture is not being exported onto them by China.
Oh, it's fascinating what we're watching right now. There are so many moves and counter moves at play. The West, it seems to have almost snookered itself at this point, and it's completely lost, and more people are either choosing to wake up and pay attention and ask some very significant questions and get themselves set up for what must be a very, very difficult time ahead for many people, and the rest of the world is content to have their heads in the sand. But in all of this, the moves from China, Russia, and the rest of these countries, the rate of knots that we're seeing is truly something to behold. And it seems that week on week now we're seeing significant changes in everything that's going on out there. Simon, we'll have to cut it off there because we've probably gone over time now. But
Yes, indeed.
It's been
Thank
absolutely...
you ever so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you. I have to end as well. Somebody's just come to my house, and it is a real pleasure to be able to share these insights with your audience. And I would please like them to bear in mind that even though these are complicated issues, this is a continuum. And hopefully I'll have the opportunity with you to explain this as things develop over the next few weeks and months.
Terrific. We really appreciate your input, and we know that these updates are absolutely paramount. Thank you, everyone. That was Simon from Florida. Simon from Flory2 at Twitter is where you will find him, and we'll catch up with a lot more as we move ahead on this broadcast and on World Series News and the Jason Q Citizen Show. I'll see you all on the next show.